From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Joelle Mitchell, and I am one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for the day, allow me to introduce my co-host, Dr. Alicia Pappas. How are you today, Alicia?
Joelle, I'm not too bad. How are you going there in Perth?
Well, it's stopped raining, so that's nice. Yep, I think we're now into the 1 or 2 weeks of spring that we get in Perth between winter and summer. So enjoy it while it lasts.
Nice. Yes, it's still freezing in Melbourne here. So, yeah, I think we're not going to get any nice weather probably until, warmer weather until it's usually October.
And have you had any progress on the issue with your roof?
Yes, so if people aren't aware, I moved into a new property. It's been probably nearly 3 months now. So I'm still waiting on the VBA, the Victorian Building Authority, to come back to me after it's been more than 6 weeks. So I haven't heard back since I put in a complaint. So long story short, there's roof plumbing issues. So when it rains, it's very noisy and I can't sleep. So watch this space. It's probably going to take another few weeks or months, but maybe for next winter I'll have some quiet.
Yeah, that'd be nice, wouldn't it? We're currently in the process of having the roof replaced on our entire complex because the roofing material that the original builder used wasn't the right spec for the angle of the roof, and that's why we've had water leaking into our ceiling for every winter for the last 10 years. So, yeah.
Well, I'm waiting for a full report from a third party that's going to come and assess the situation. So for now, I think I know what the problem is, but I wouldn't be surprised if they come and find some more issues. So, yes, we will see.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's not a fun exercise having to, deal with builders who are trying to be dodgy and try to get away with stuff. And when you have to get the authority involved, that just makes it all an even longer process. So
and there are backlogged. So the problem is rife, isn't it? It's it's not good at the moment, the construction industry, but hopefully their regs change too, so they're getting a bit more strict on what you can do and what you can't do.
Yep. Well, hopefully, as you say, next winter it'll be resolved and then you can sleep.
Meanwhile, La Nina's coming, I think, in spring. So
no rest for Alicia then.
No, probably not.
All right. Well, let's introduce our guest for today, shall we?
Let's do that.
All right. She's a repeat guest, so listeners will probably be familiar with her. She has a PhD in business, a Master of Management Research and an MBA. She has significant experience in the human resources function and is currently the founder and managing director of PsychSafe. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Rebecca Michalak.
Thank you so much, Joelle. And perfect pronunciation on the surname. Good on you.
It's almost like I asked you how to pronounce it.
But we'll refer to you as Dr. Bex.
Dr. Bex, yep.
That's it. That'd be awesome. Or even just Bex. Even just Bex is fine.
You got to use that doctor. That's, it's an important...
it was probably pretty
important title.
Hard fought. 4.5 years to get it, I guess. So, but it's been interesting. If you think about it during COVID, if it's on your profile, people do automatically kind of assume that you're a medical doctor, and then you need to correct them, and then trying to explain that it's in business, but in organisational psychology and strategy, crossed with HR and risk management, just pops a blood vessel somewhere. They just don't get it really.
Yeah, I think that's why probably lots of people just have PhD after their name instead of doctor before the name.
Yeah. And I thought, I guess people have mixed views on Dr. Phil, but it certainly worked in his favour. And I guess
He
years
doesn't
ago,
even have a PhD though, does he?
I don't think he does. And I don't know. I guess now he's got a brand around it, so he sticks with it. I don't know. I guess I was looking for something semi-funky and easier to say than my full name, and this popped up as an option. So, and it's kind of stuck.
Well,
I think people started calling me it. Yeah, they started calling me it when we were studying, because we started, when we had those days where we thought, oh my goodness, are we ever going to get to the end of this degree? People would say, just remember, it's going to be Dr. Bex or Dr. Butt or Dr. Butt, at the end of it. And it just, it sort of stuck from there. I have a colleague who actually got his business cards made up in advance with the doctor title on, just to keep himself focused.
Bold.
Later.
Yeah. It was like, you want to make sure now you actually pass examination, because that would be embarrassing. But
That's one way to do it.
He got through.
Yeah. No, not something that I've actively contemplated myself. Yeah. No.
Probably sensible. I mean, I guess I remember I don't think mentoring is the right word, but I do remember a new person being put on to myself and my colleague, Dr. Michael Axelson, who's in a completely different field, business information systems and cybersecurity. And we were put forward for whatever reason to have a chat to this new PhD candidate and take her for a coffee. She is now Dr. Gemma, so she did get through. But one of the first things we said is, why? Because if you're not clear on why now, you're really going to struggle in about 2 years' time when you really go, gee, what did I sign up for this for? So, yeah.
People ask me too, was it worth it, or should I do it? Because I did a doctorate, so it's kind of a master's and PhD at the same time in
together,
less years.
Yeah,
a very big insult. So I say now, in hindsight, unless you're really wanting to work in academia at some point, or if that's where you see yourself going, there's probably not a real big advantage if we're talking about psychology. So my background is clinical psychology. So even, back then when I did it, there was less hurdles, I guess, to jump when you're getting your registration after you did a doctorate. You basically were a clinical psychologist straight away, because you did an extra year in your study of supervised placement. So you basically worked an extra year as part of your process. But now they've changed it, so you still need to get supervised for another year on top of a doctorate. So I'm like, unless you want to work in academia, probably not. It's probably not.
Yeah, my colleagues and I have had lots of conversations about it, because, I mean, I guess there was a cohort of us that got together that came from practice. So we were going back from industry back into academia to go and do a PhD. So I guess our motivations were a little bit different. It was around sort of, loosely speaking, we recognised the issues in industry and we wanted to go off and really dissect them and come back with some solutions. And I think that our university system is really failing us. Different across different disciplines, because it varies quite a lot, but in sort of business and management more generally, because I sat in a business school, I thought there was an astronomical gap between what the academics were doing and what actually happens out in practice. And it's a pity that the PhD is not more considered something that you could take back out into industry and really make a difference with. And part of that is to do with the way that the programs are delivered. They really are very honed in. If you're going to become an academic, and they don't really, generally speaking, cover any other alternative. And I think then there's a gap in a translation piece, a gap to close in a translation piece, where we talk about the wider skills that those PhD candidates get in, analytics and critical reflection and research and things that could go into any industry and be really handy, and sort of get rid of the patches on the elbows, professor, stale, stagnant, whatever you want to call it, regimented, narrow thinking academic, which is some people's perceptions of what they are, and go, no, these people have actually gone off and they are now sort of really quite expert in their field. They've got work experience, they get how the industry works, or they get how a given profession works, and now they've got this high level knowledge and skills as well. So yeah, it's something I'm quite passionate about, and the background is research, engagement and impact, and bridging that gap between what we do in research and what we do in organisations. And we'll talk about it in the podcast today, because one of the points I'd like to make is around evidence-based practice. So we'll probably come back to it.
So this episode will be exploring perceptions of HR specifically, so the HR function within large organisations. Beck, can you share your professional background as it relates to HR?
Look, I haven't got a straightforward HR background, as those people who know me will be aware, but I've worked in ops management with a HR and staffing focus for a number of years in my early management career, and while I was studying my psych degree and so on, and then moved into working in HR and worked across a couple of the main functions. I worked in safety and health and risk management and insurance, so dealt with workers' comp and those sorts of issues, occupational health and safety centric role, and then went from there into industrial relations and employee relations, and then did a bit of a stint as a generalist, so to speak, at sort of a mid-range level. Then had finished my MBA and decided to head out on my own and did some HR consulting. Spent a lot of time doing tailored learning and development. I had a registered training organisation and did a lot of customised programs, particularly focusing on training and assessment more broadly. So did nearly 3 years of that, and really honed my, I guess, L&D, OED type skills. Then over a period of time, decided to go back and do my PhD. But before I actually started it, I did a stint as Director of HR, People and Performance in Professional Services for nearly a couple of years, give or take. And so that was running the HR function for a commercial law firm. So I've sort of been in the trenches, but probably not in that straightforward, did a HR degree and went through that way kind of method. And then since running my own business, I do a lot that bounces off HR, though I'm more often brought in under the safety division, so to speak. It seems to be the pattern at the moment. And also did my PhD was strategic HR focused, I guess, with an org psych, forensic psych, clinical psych / risk management and organisational behaviour, somewhere business thrown in there kind of flavour. It was quite eclectic. And I did some consulting while I was studying as well, looking at teaching OED and strategic HR and sort of affiliated projects at master's level and for a federally funded program run through AusAid. So sort of kept tabs on industry while I was doing that. So yeah, kind of, I would say I've been in the trenches. If somebody said, have you been in HR? I've said, I've been in the HR trenches.
I think you definitely have, yes. You've got a broad and varied background from consulting to internal functions. So I think you're a good judge of, how HR operates and what's required.
So what sort of prompted our episode today is that there was an article published by HRD Magazine recently, and the title of it was HR is Not Your Friend. And they were referencing an insider interview with someone called Chris Williams, who's the former VP of HR at Microsoft. So one of the quotes from the interview that they include is Chris saying the following: if you have a problem with another employee, especially your manager, and you decide to involve HR, you're not enlisting someone on your side. Instead, you're involving the company in the issue, end quote. So, Beck, what do you think Chris is getting at with that statement?
Look, when I read it, I thought I can really see where he's coming from. And I guess that's probably in some ways a pretty unfortunate reflection on the profession. And I have been quite vocal, particularly in recent years, about HR more generally, in my view, needing to take a good long hard look at itself, and improve a number of the things that it does. There are things it needs to stop doing, and there's things it needs to start doing. So yes, I understood where he was coming from, and I think, given the flavour of this podcast, if we keep it more honed in things around conflict as it might relate to things like psych hazards. I mean, the HR perspective, and I've been quite vocal on us needing to change from a HR lens to a safety lens on a range of issues and organisations, because the HR lens tends to position things like conflict and bullying and harassment and other interpersonal behaviours, poor leadership, other interpersonal behaviour type phenomena in organisations. They position these things as disputes or grievances, and it's a really problematic lens to have. We need to be shifting our thinking on these issues as not being grievances or disputes, but actually being psych hazard exposures. And it really does shift the way that we deal with them. So, yeah, I think when he talked about HR is not your friend, the other thing we need to remember is that at the end of the day, HR is a representative of the organisation, right? They are internal. So you are involving the business in that issue. There would be some things that this probably applies less to, but again, if we focus in on things like conflict, high levels of conflict with people, bullying, harassment, power abuse, anything like that, which tends to be wrapped up in those conflict spaces, aggressive behaviour, covert undermining, those kind of things, they are all actually psych hazards. They're not grievances and they're not disputes. So, if somebody comes forward and raises an issue about that, we have a plethora of evidence that the way HR would typically respond, if we keep it to responses at this point in time, is pretty inappropriate. And I would probably go one further step to what he raised when he said HR is not your friend. While HR is a representative of the organisation, I actually think there's a lot of evidence that it's actually really not doing the right thing by organisations either. And I want to preface this with, I think that there is a positioning that HR can only be for the employer or for the worker, and it's a really fatalistic position, because if you do things right, you actually can serve the purposes of the workers and the business at the same time, and that's really what strategic HR is meant to be about. It's not meant to be about only protecting the business interests and leaving the workers aside, or only looking after the workers and forgetting about the business. They have to coexist. So, I think, I can share some examples, but I think that HR actually is really struggling with even serving the needs of the business. I question whether HR is on the business's side either, frankly.
Yeah, so I think we will explore that in the coming questions that we've got there. I think just thinking about it from like an employee who is, having a conflict with their manager and thinking about going to HR with it, given that framing of, well, HR are there to, if you do that, you're involving the company in the issue. What are the implications for the employee in that situation, bringing that, that conflict with their manager to the company, essentially?
See, I think it shouldn't be an issue. It is, but it shouldn't be an issue, because if you're raising concern about perhaps managers' conduct, even their competence, if it was that, then those efforts to speak up are generally housed. So if a worker raises a concern, it's generally housed in them wanting to see an improvement And believe it or not, in the fact that they care about the business too. So I've seen cases before where, say, for example, a new manager has been brought in. I'll reflect on a case from many years ago that still sticks with me. A guy who was on one of my cert for training and assessment courses, and we talked about why each participant was doing it. And the skinny is he'd left quite a lucrative position in mining. He was the 18th person out of a 19-person technical department to leave. A new manager had been brought in, and sometimes managers are brought in to sort wheat from chaff. I know, I've done it myself. But if you've got a technical department and 18 people leave in the 18 months following a new manager being brought in, you really need to start questioning what's going on with that manager, right? And multiple efforts were made to speak up by those employees. So let's just say whether you wanted to bring it down to a conflict or whether they had concerns about the manager's competence. And it just fell on deaf ears. And more people left, and this person became what we would loosely refer to as a toxin handler. They tried going multiple levels up in the organisation to try to get something done about this particular manager, and just nothing happened. And they were the 18th person to leave. And I was reflecting on it, funnily enough, a couple of days ago, because that was in the peak of the mining boom, right? Not the most recent one, the one before it probably. And turnover in a technical department of 100% could have bought you probably a nice little Pershing yacht, right? It's expensive. So again, that was a case where the conflict, and I was with this particular individual for 12 full days. I think I got a decent grip on whether they were genuine in the way they were talking about the issues they faced in their workplace. I didn't have any reason to not believe their position on it, understanding it was just their position. But, that's an example of a conflict that got taken to HR, it got taken to management, it got taken to a bunch of people, and nothing happened with it. And ultimately, the damage was to the business. If you have that sort of turnover in the technical department in particular, that hampers business objectives. So, yeah, I think when Chris was referring to taking an issue to HR, again, if we house it in that, if it's a conflict, there's bullying, harassment, or competence issues going on, you are involving the business in that. The response of the business should be in its best interests, but often what HR does is not in the interests of any party. It's not in the interests of the business, and it's not in the interests of the worker. And going back to what I said earlier, they are not mutually exclusive. We need to move away from the mindset that achieving good things for workers means detriment to the business, or achieving good things for the business means detriment to workers. They coexist. They should coexist, and they should complement each other. And if you're not achieving that in HR, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah, definitely agree. I found that article quite it had a very strong bias in terms of the way HR is perceived. So there was reference to, HR is akin to the police, and it was very employee versus employer. But you're right. If HR is not looking after its people, and, I've worked in an HR space before. My role was a little bit different. So I was trying to kind of bring in maybe some different ways of doing things, so it wasn't so black and white. So, you're right when you say grievances or conflict, people don't even like reporting that or approaching HR about it, or they don't know who to turn to, because there's an assumption that what you're saying, there's an assumption that it won't be in the favor of the employee, that it's going to be, escalated to the point where there'll be negative outcomes or consequences for the employee. It goes very formal very quickly. It's kind of like, well, you can we can file an investigation. There's just a lack of taking the time to understand what's actually going on for that employee, taking the time to listen, understand, identify the root causes of why they're experiencing what they're experiencing, and then from an early intervention perspective, more informally, how do we resolve the issue? Because a lot of the time, and this is what I found too, a lot of the time you can resolve the issue informally without going through these formal, logger official grievance, and then we're going to get someone to investigate the problem. It's very procedural and policy driven, and it's not in the best interest of either party. So I think, moving forward, it's and strategically, how do we have more informal, I don't know if you're aware of the term restorative justice, but just those, exploring how can we actually bring whoever's involved together in a safe way to explore what's happened, to then come to a resolution. Because you find oftentimes taking the time to do that, it does resolve the issue, what prevents further harm.
Yeah, and there's so many valuable points that you've touched on there. I'm going to try to remember at least a few of them and go back to them. So something that I've noticed about HR as well is that it has such a fatalistic stance itself on these things. So if you have a conflict, it's kind of like there's going to be a winner and a loser. Like you said, there's an escalation to an investigation. It's, separate to that, the way the investigation is conducted is rarely trauma-informed. It is usually heavily biased. There is a focus on procedural justice and natural justice, but it seems to be very biased in favour of protecting the rights of the accused, and the rights of the complainant just seem to be parked, I don't know, in a different car park somewhere. And, it speaks to that whole lens shift of treating it like a dispute or a grievance, rather than treating many of these conflict-based situations as being probably psych hazard exposures that need to have that safety lens done. And in being, and I've said before, at the end of an investigation, often or during an investigation, a dispute lens says winner or loser, right? So somebody has to lose out of this. And it often results in the wrong person leaving the organisation. Wouldn't it be great if we could get to a space where we could raise things in, I call them when they're small. So they're small issues, they're not massive. Smaller issues are much easier to resolve informally. And having that, what we're seeing a pattern of now is that the complaints that tend to hit HR in the end are, not always, but often quite severe. Like they've been going on for months. They are chronic situations. From a psychological contract point of view, there's been probably almost irreparable damage done. It's, you've missed so many opportunities to intervene when the issue was small. And that's part of, you touched on fear of negative consequences. I mean, the reality is people don't feel comfortable going to HR with issues. And there's good reason for that, unfortunately. The evidence tells us that if you go to HR with an issue, a complaint or to talk about somebody's behaviour, you feel like you're being bullied, overworked, micromanaged, whatever the case may be, if you go to HR, they're often responsible for either enacting, condoning, or advising people to execute on a whole bunch of adverse actions that we see happen. So, and I mean adverse actions in the true sense of under general protections, adverse actions occurring, but also then in terms of just general negative consequences. So, if we look at the research on post-voice victimization in organizations, so that's where somebody has raised a concern and they've studied, what was the response to that. Unfortunately, HR is in the thick of it for further victimizing the person who's just brought something of concern to the table. So, the negative response of it's victim blaming. Well, you sure it isn't just you? You sure it isn't your behavior? Like, that sort of antagonistic take. Responding by putting the person on a performance management plan, or withholding training, or withholding a promotion, or all these other work-related levers that tend to get pulled by HR. So, if it's not pulled by HR has advised a manager somewhere, yep, this is a completely legitimate response. A person's raised a concern about your competence as a manager, or that you're micromanaging or behaving poorly towards them. Yep, totally appropriate response, put them on a performance improvement plan. and ultimately let's just wheedle them out of the organisation. So, like I said, I think when people say, HR is not your friend, I agree with them in many respects. I do want to insert a little disclaimer here. There is a lot of variation, and I'm talking quite broadly, and there are some HR operators that I know that are brilliant, right? There's some really, really good people out there. And, if you want to go into more of the different reasons why HR might respond in those inappropriate ways, one of them is that HR is often disempowered itself and feeling under threat itself within an organisation. And I understand that. So that can make it very difficult for HR to do good, effective, right things, right? So I do have a piece up on LinkedIn where I talk specifically about things like psych injuries and the sorts of behaviours that lead to that and the role of HR or failures of HR. And I looked at a couple of, I guess, ways that HR fails. And some of it is a lack of competence, some of it is a lack of resources, some of it is a lack of power, some of it is laziness. There's a whole range of things in there. But, they are, if we look at the evidence, they are either responsible or have their fingers in the pies of a lot of negative consequences that occur if an employee raises an issue. And they need to own that. They need to recognise that they have been right in the thick of that and start changing things. So, your fear of negative consequences is really big. It's that fatalistic winner-loser approach. It's that failure to get in when things are small and resolve them informally. And, the safety perspective on things like bullying and harassment and overwork and things of that ilk is that if you encourage that psychologically safe culture and people bring things up when they're a minor concern or even not necessarily concern yet or could become a concern, you have so much more capacity to engage in those restorative justice mechanisms and engage in learning. So if a person is behaving inappropriately and it is literally because they don't realise they are, but if they knew that they were, they could change their behaviour with a bit of, capability build or whatever you want to call it, then wouldn't it be better to be intervening then instead of this fatalistic winner-loser, somebody goes from the organisation, right? Having those small conversations on an informal basis, engaging in restorative justice where it's like, okay, thank you for raising the fact that behaviour is inappropriate. Fortunately, it hasn't resulted in a psych injury or something of that nature this time round. And we can work with the person that you've raised this concern about. And, it doesn't need to be that somebody needs to leave the organisation. That shouldn't be where we start out, that we're in a position where it's going to look like that. So,
and it's not focusing also on, instilling something negative. It's just, you're right. A lot of the time it's the lack of awareness. Someone doesn't have that awareness. This is causing this person harm or, stress or whatever it is. So it's in the way that it's dealt with, where it's, you can hear from both people and come to a resolution. Like you said, before major harm is done, you're more likely to if you're bringing up the issue in a non-disciplinary, safe way and just creating a space for both people to come together and give their perspectives and then, involving both in the solution or the resolution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, one of the key issues with this distrust, I'll call it distrust in HR, because they're really high, and we've got research on this. It's not a trusted function in organisations. And again, if I was to draw a comparison with safety has much more of a flavour. It's not perfect by any means, but much more of a flavour of being, there to help the employees. And business tends to value it that little bit more because, there are some regs behind it and you can't delegate your safety duties, as we know, they're non-delegable. So, there's more of a focus on internal safety, I think, than necessarily HR. I think HR is almost in a position now where it risks being Japanesed out of organisations because there's been some other wider conversations on, is HR a profession or is it a group of professions, for example? I mean, there's many specialities within it. And, we've seen, a fair bit of what I call HR throwing its hands up in the air and saying that's not our gig or not our responsibility recently. And I'll share an example of that, a bit like the Royal Banking Commission, and looking at the unethical conduct within financial services firms and things like that. And, there was a bit of argy-bargy around those findings where, they were saying it's systemic, like it's through these organisations, it's occurring at every level, it's occurring across so many different tasks and functions. This is not a single bad egg kind of scenario. It's cultural. And then I saw a few pieces where HR, loosely speaking, sort of came back and said, culture is not our gig. Don't look at us. We're not responsible for that. Culture is leadership's kind of domain. And I thought, ooh, you've been saying for years that you're custodians of culture. That's been one of the things you've used to justify your existence. And now when, cultural problems are being, brought down and HR is being questioned about your role in this, to throw up your hands and say we're not involved. Absolutely, you're involved. Yes, leadership's important, of course it is. But, you design the incentive schemes, you design the performance appraisal and management schemes, you design the recruitment processes that bring in certain people, right? You get rid of other certain people. Like, there are so many things that you touch that contribute to systemic issues in organisations. And if you want to throw up your hands and say we're not responsible for that, do you know what? There's a lot of transactional stuff that HR does that AI could probably take over in future. And then there's these other specialist things that you could bring in specialists to do that might actually just say a HR generalist is actually not needed anymore. So I think HR needs to be very careful about, confronting some of the realities around things that they've been doing that haven't been working and work to improve that, because I think there is a risk that as a profession, it's always struggled to get a seat at the table. And I think it continues to struggle to get a seat at the table. And when we're looking around things to do with psych health and safety, we're looking at that gaining a lot of traction through workplace health and safety and going up there through to ESG. And HR isn't really necessarily on the bandwagon. They're still in that wellbeing, cute and fluffy yoga and fruit bowls space. So yeah, I think HR has a lot of work to do, and it would probably be best in these scenarios if it was collaborating, or maybe I've suggested before, even taking the lead. Let workplace health and safety take the lead, and you bring in its expertise underneath a health and safety lens, because health and safety is about harm prevention, and the HR lens is about harm management. And we need to change that fundamentally. I mean, things like conflict, even if it is a personality clash, right? The classic. Are you sure it's just not a personality clash? Even if it is, safety gives us a lens to deal with that in a harm prevention way. HR says go off and solve it yourself, kind of thing, like both of you grow up. It fails to recognise often power imbalances that exist. And we talked a little bit about investigations and informal resolution pathways. And even the way that HR seems to be executing on informal resolution pathways seems to be pretty flawed. Like, I know multiple large organisations, for example, who still don't have a trauma-informed approach, who still have that grievance dispute lens around conflict, aggression, bullying, sexual harassment, discrimination. And they'll say, resolve the conflict at the source. Okay, so you're being exposed to a hazard, but go and have a chat with the person responsible for the behaviours that are harming you. Good move. And when that fails, then, we'll put you in a face-to-face mediation with the person responsible for the behaviours that you've just raised as being harmful to you. And we'll force you through that. And then at some point in time, you might get through to an investigation. And you wonder why people don't trust bringing issues to HR. I don't wonder. I think it's really clear why they don't. So again, we need to shift the dial on there and go. We need to get out of harm management, this reaction, waiting for somebody to come and raise an issue. I mean, there's another issue. It's that reaction. HR waits for somebody to raise a complaint. They're not really out there going, please give us, informal data, or, they're not going out and looking for lead indicators of behaviour that might be escalating or problematic. We've sent out a ton of engagement surveys that are really designed to give them data on how great things are. They don't do so much around going out and looking actively for small issues that they could potentially resolve in a proactive fashion. So again, we spoke earlier about, by the time something gets to HR, it's often escalated to the point of no return. And all of those early intervention points, or dealing with it was small, and where we could have done something restorative, and, people could have learnt, and both people who are perhaps involved in the conflict per se could have stayed and worked really well together, and both talent could have been retained. Well, all of those opportunities have been missed.
Yeah, definitely. There are some big flaws in the way HR, I suppose, handles a lot of these issues. And there's you're kind of saying needs to sit maybe within health and safety rather than HR, to be dealt with as this is a psychological hazard. How do we deal with it? And there needs to be, processes and approaches like early intervention, restorative justice to deal with these things. And it's having, I think, an overhaul of those procedures, but then having, people that are competent to actually deal with the issues as well. And who are those people, and what's their background, and where do they sit? So yeah, definitely massive changes need to happen. So from your perspective, Beck, if you could create a parallel universe, so the only difference from our universe to this parallel universe is how an HR division would function, what would it look like?
Look, there's just so many things. Let me try and bring it down to. I'll try to bring it down to maybe my top 3 things that I'd love to see HR do and achieve. I'd love to see HR being more evidence-based. And the reason for me raising that is I do know it struggles to get a seat at the table. If you don't critically reflect on what you're doing and go, okay, this really it's not working. We aren't getting the return on investment. We're not kicking the goals that we're saying to management will kick with a given initiative. We can bring at least a good chunk of those failures down to what we're doing in HR not being evidence-based. I used the phrase the other day, they're brain farts, thought bubbles, and snake oil. And I would love to see HR be really, really evidence-based. So not just, somebody said that this would be good for well-being, or, this is the solution for that, or this product or service, or whatever it is. And going, well, what is the evidence that this actually works? And if it works, does it work in the context that we would like to apply it? And I think if HR was doing that a lot more, then that capacity to win the ears of the executive and the seat at the table comes unfortunately or unfortunately with the capacity to communicate that ROI. And if you're not doing evidence-based practice, you are not going to achieve an ROI. If you do, it's a fluke, right? If you go bowling in there with something that's not evidence-based and it happens to work, that is a fluke. I don't think any profession should be relying on things being a fluke to succeed. So I'd love to see HR being more evidence-based, and I think it will really help them. I would like to see HR working with safety and other areas of the business in less of a we run the show here fashion, and you all kind of report to us attitude. I think in regards to what we've been talking about today to do with conflict and the sort of issues that might end up in HR is there is a strong argument for those to be housed under safety and then HR to be brought in to assist where relevant. So I'd love to see HR get a little bit out of its box of they know it all and they can take charge of it all, and grabbing jurisdiction over certain things and go, actually, do you know what? Maybe we need to learn from these other professions, and not in a we hold jurisdiction and you come and work for us kind of thing, in more of a collaborative fashion. We've talked on other episodes of the podcast of what we want to achieve in psych health and safety and worker wellbeing and so on, really requires a transdisciplinary approach. We are still in the weeds of the safety versus HR kind of, I'm calling it a grow through phase, right? I think it's something we need to grow through and ultimately get to a more strategic, collaborative, transdisciplinary kind of approach to things. But yes, I think HR learning that it is not the solution to everything, and there are other disciplines or contributing areas that could really add value, and working with those. I think the third thing would be really around that critical self-reflection, because I think that anything we would like to see changed is going to be contingent on that recognition that what we're doing is not working. And the evidence I've seen so far seems to be weighted in, if HR is criticised for something, they defer it, or they throw their hands up, or have a similar kind of response. You can't change what you don't recognise as a problem. So if HR is collectively patting itself on the back for being an amazing profession, and that's just what they do, and there's no reflection around, hey, what do we need to change in our practice, and what are we doing that's not working, then I think that's probably the precursor to anything really shifting the dial, is being able to say, we need to take a good, long, hard look at ourselves as a profession. Stop lamenting that we don't have the seat at the table, and look at why, and look at what we need to change to get that seat at the table. So they would be probably my 3 points, that I would like to see evidence-based, a lot more evidence-based practice, that I would like to see collaboration and a transdisciplinary approach without HR grabbing jurisdiction and considering itself the be-all and end-all. And I would like to see that critical self-reflection occurring as a profession.
So, Beck, could you maybe give us a bit more of a explanation of what you mean when you say transdisciplinary approach?
So, and even within HR, we have people with different skill sets. So you've got, maybe your HR generalist might be a person who's worked across multiple functions at some sort of entry to moderate level, and has, the heads across OED, broadly speaking, or learning and development, industrial relations, employee relations, some of the other key functions that we see, payroll, incentive schemes and stuff. So you can subdivide HR, but like, for example, some HR people now are org psychs, and I think that psychology brings a wonderful lens to a lot of the things we want to achieve in our fields. The business risk and business strategy more broadly lens. So getting people in who have that expertise. The safety lens is in there because it does have the risk management lens already embedded. But so you're trying to bring together, business people, psychologists, HR generalists, industrial relations specialists, employee relations specialists, organizational behavior specialists, and then bringing in business risk, corporate governance, strategy level people too, because most of these things that we're facing are probably in that bucket of wicked problems. There isn't a silver bullet. We'll go through a lot of trial and error of things that, won't work perfectly. Some of them might backfire spectacularly. But, if we can, don't let perfect get in the way of better. So I think that, ultimately we need that transdisciplinary approach, which is that value of going, let's talk to psych on this one issue. Let's talk to a psych. Let's talk to a business person. Let's talk to a logistics person. Let's talk to finance. Let's talk to the HR person. Let's talk to industrial relations. Let's talk to safety, and let's get a holistic view on it. Come at it from a multiple angles, and really come up with solutions that are evidence-based that are more likely to work. Not just going at it from one lens. So yeah, I would definitely like to see us recognizing the value of, different specialities and what they can bring to the table to solve problems and move us forward.
Yeah, so what you're really talking about there is diversity, and probably, professional diversity, I guess, and sort of career diversity, feeding into that function and giving it a much more well-informed approach to be able to, I guess, both inform organisational strategy as well as respond to problems that might emerge.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess if we look at a range of the things that have come up more recently, there has been, I've at least observed in the psych health and safety space, HR sort of grabbing jurisdiction and being very unwilling to let go, and having quite an obnoxious look down view on safety people, like kind of don't touch well-being is our gig, get out of our territory. And again, no critical reflection to say, actually what we're doing in that space really isn't working. Maybe you could add value, come and have a chat with us. So yeah, I would really challenge HR, I guess, overall to go, if you're going to be grabbing jurisdiction for something, you better be doing it well. And the reality is, the evidence tells us there are a lot of things that are currently argued to be your jurisdiction that you're not doing well. And you could do a lot better if you would bring in other expertise and start considering those multiple inputs instead of a sort of singular siloed approach.
Excellent points there. I want to just bring us back to the HRD article, because it ended with some advice from Williams that I have an opinion about, but I'm interested in your opinion about it. The advice was for staff experiencing workplace conflict to turn to friends, family, or a therapist for help with that. What are your thoughts on that advice, Beck?
Again, I can see where he's coming from. I would almost add in there, throw in a lawyer at the same time. I guess it depends. Exactly. I guess it depends on what the end game is for that person in regards to that conflict. I do think there is value in having multiple inputs, for example. If you've got a problem, getting multiple viewpoints and running it past different people to get their perspectives. Again, that kind of wicked problem, get multiple viewpoints, join them together and come up with a solution approach. So, I think you could go to a psychologist and get some strategies and some advice on how you might deal, particularly if you're in a stressed state, some strategies on how you can sort of deal with your emotions, because we know from the research, again, if you're highly stressed and highly emotional, it's very difficult to solve problems because different areas of our brain are being used, and our higher order functioning can often be, which is where we try to solve problems, can be affected by those things. So yes, there is value if you've got a conflict going and it's stressful, in particular, going to somebody who might help you with those stress effects, like a psychologist or a therapist or a counselor. I think there is value in getting a different viewpoint just from somebody who's just like a colleague kind of level person who gets your industry and the situation and could probably, just give you a bit of an outsider's view on what your take is on the issue. I think I would have to say that probably going to HR in most organisations is going to be one of your last resorts still at this stage. Going and getting legal advice, it might be that you need to do that, to say, look, if I raise this issue and they respond this way, which is how I expect them to respond, what are my rights and how do I do this correctly? So yes, I do agree with the thought of the suggestion of going to other people other than HR. At the end of the day, though, if we want to change the issue, we need to confront it. So that's kind of an avoidant thing. It's not making HR change if other parties are constantly kind of picking up the pieces of what HR practices are creating as issues. Then ultimately, if we want that to change, we need to be bringing these issues to HR and encouraging them to deal with them better. If an individual is in a stressed state, I don't know that I would suggest that that's the individual to go and take on that challenge. It's probably not appropriate. But like I said, I don't know that my first suggestion would be go to HR. I'd probably be, depending on the situation, talking about a range of other sources of information, bounce off ideas kind of thing that you could go to first, at least. Your view, Joelle, I'm interested.
Look, I think to an extent, it's always useful to talk to somebody, outside of that situation and say, look, am I being unreasonable here? What's your perspective? So it can help to get that sort of independent perspective. But I also think, there has to be a role. The organisation has to take some responsibility for this as well. They can't just, if you think about this then and how that informs, ESG, how can you continue to have a social license to operate if your response to any conflict, any grievances in your organisation is for the person to take it out of the organisation to manage? So you're literally just outsourcing all of your problems to society, rather than actually taking responsibility for them as a business. So that's my perspective. Alicia?
Yeah, I think you're both highlighting, similar ideas, and it's my view as well that it's always good to get a third party perspective, whether that's a family member or a friend or a colleague, just to talk through how you're seeing things and how you're feeling and getting, that third party objective view. But at the end of the day, if you're only relying on, getting support or having a vent to these people outside of the organization, the problem just will perpetuate, if not get worse, and there's no accountability from the employer to actually deal with it. So, yeah, I think we're all kind of saying the article says not to go to HR, but I think it's good to do both first to get some support, and maybe some, like you said, very well said there, Beck, just to, regulate your emotions. Even talking it through helps to regulate your emotions, just to be able to get into that, rational thought space that's often hampered when we're highly stressed and emotional. But then, if you're not bringing it to the business in some way, it's just going to go probably pear-shaped, more so for you, and the problem will get bigger, if not, lead to a psychological injury, or you'll leave the company. So that's my view on it.
And if I could just add one little point to that I think HR would benefit from taking on board, is internal whistleblowing and internal voice is your friend. It's the business's friend, it's the worker's friend, and it's your friend. And being scared of those reports and actively deterring them in many respects through those negative consequences that are often issued for anybody who does speak up about something, does encourage external whistleblowing, right? We know from the research that particularly, loosely speaking, competent, dedicated employees will often try some level of internal voice around an issue first. Okay, so they actually give the organisation an opportunity. They're pro-organisation and they're being active and they're raising the issue because they'd like to see something changed. And it is through inappropriate responses to those efforts to voice that they go through usually a range of different strategies, but often end in anti-organisational, retaliatory protect the self at all costs positions, which means they get on the phone to a journalist and they tell a journalist what's going on. And I say to organisations, probably one of the worst things for you from a business point of view once that occurs is it doesn't really matter how valid that person's concern is or how accurate their perception is around the issue they're raising, right? It's now out in the media and it'll take on a life of its own, right? It actually, at that point, doesn't really matter who's right or wrong. It will go on a journey that's probably not good for a lot of people and parties, stakeholders along the way. So yeah, HR, internal whistleblowing is your friend. Encouraging people to come to you and then responding appropriately is your friend. And you need to do more to encourage that. And if you're encouraging it, you need to respond to it appropriately. There's no point saying, we encourage you to come to us with your issues and concerns if the first thing you do is victim blame and then instigate a whole range of other practices that just are negative for the person who's raised that issue. So avoid external whistleblowing. Use internal whistleblowing as your friend.
Yeah. So that's some good advice for organisations or people working within HR to take. Are there any other steps or any more advice that you'd offer to organisations in terms of dealing with workplace conflict?
Take a long-term view. You need to take a long-term view. I think a lot of the things that we see that are negative in this space adopt a very short-term view. It's, we've got this singular conflict issue. We just want that resolved. We don't want to look at drivers. We don't want to look at, piecing together the fact that there's actually multiple examples of that going on. We just want to fix this little issue, get it done, and dust it as quickly as we can. And we don't want to actually deal with any longer-term consequences of what we do in this moment now. We need to take a longer-term view that is about understanding the drivers of those issues and concerns and addressing those and, making sure whatever solutions we're trying to execute on, again, sort of have that a return on investment kind of flavour to it. Now, that might mean a cost early on to get returns later in the process, but it's about making that investment. So, yeah, take a longer term view. It's not about one employee bringing one conflict to you, right? It's about all of the conflicts over time. What's driving them? What are the effects if we don't respond appropriately here? How does that reinforce cultures of silence? How does that enable, persons responsible for certain behaviours that are really toxic in organisations? So longer term view. We need to take a longer term view. And that goes to ESG and strategy and getting the executive ear. All of that is all interlinked.
Well, Beck, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I think you've teased out some really useful insights, and hopefully our HR listeners didn't turn off at the beginning of the episode thinking it was just going to be a HR bashing exercise, and they've still listened, because I think that you've really given them lots of practical food for thought, and some real opportunities to look at how they can improve and become a more integrated and sort of vital part of an organisation, and to actually create positive change within organisations. So with everything that we've talked about, what would you say are your hopes for the future of the human resources function?
I hope it continues to exist. I actually do, in a really forward-thinking way, have concerns that it could dissolve as a profession as we currently know it. I do think it's got the capacity to add a lot of value, and I really hope that it can engage in that profession-wide self-reflection and refresh, and take a new path forward. We'll come back to this in 10 years' time and see, did HR survive? did it reinvigorate itself? Did it transform itself? And, you know, maybe it looked very different in 10 years' time. But I do think that as a profession overall, it's got a lot of value to add. It's just not delivering on it at the moment.
Mm.
So just finally, some parting words of advice for listeners who are wanting to change how HR is positioned in their organisation, so specifically for our HR folk listening.
I think for your HR practitioners, it does start with you. So I guess we've been talking about the profession more widely, and I did say earlier in my responses that there is huge variation. There's some excellent operators out there, and I'd like to see more of those really good operators out there sharing what they're doing that's working. But it does start with you. If you're a HR practitioner, reflecting on, you know, some of the things perhaps that I've raised today and going, gosh, am I doing that? Am I advising others in my organisation or my team to be doing some of those things? You know, have I been facilitating adverse actions or negative consequences for people who speak up and not really, I guess, fighting the good fight with that longer term view that serves both worker purpose and business purpose? So yeah, as an individual, do that critical self-reflection work yourself. And if you're doing things well, share them. And if you're not, there's a heap of resources and assistance on hand, and people wanting to collaborate with HR and work together better. So go looking for them and be open to those suggestions and those collaborations. And it does start with you. You are a member of a profession. And when you get, you know, as we know, lots of members of the profession operating in a consistent way, that defines what the profession looks like. So, you know, maybe try to be the HR professional that bucks the trend and get others on board to buck the trend and create a new face of HR and a new perspective on HR.
Good advice. Shake up the status quo. I like it.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of another fascinating episode with you, Beck, and I really do appreciate the insights that you're able to bring from your extensive and very varied background. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm sure that our listeners have really appreciated getting to hear your views on these things as well. Where can our listeners get hold of you if they want to further the conversation or ask for some help?
Oh, look, I welcome any listener that would, in particular, would like to challenge me. Please bring it on, so to speak. But if you've got questions or you would like more evidence around any of the points I've kind of raised, or, you know, maybe some connections to people that could assist you on your journey of self-reflection and maybe capability building in this space, you know, reach out. I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me there. I run a consultancy called PsychSafe, so you can look us up online and reach out. So my contact details are quite widely available. So go for your life, get in touch, and love to have a conversation with you.
Thanks, Beck, and we'll stick the web link to your webpage in the show notes as well, so people can check that out. So that's it for us today, listeners. Remember that if you do want to check out the full video, you can do that over on our YouTube channel. We will be posting some mini clips from today's episode, so they'll get posted on LinkedIn as we usually do. You can head on over to the Flourish LinkedIn page or the Flourish DX LinkedIn page if you want to see previous clips that we've posted there. And you can always connect with Alicia and me on LinkedIn. We're on there quite a bit and we're always happy for a chat. So that's it for today, listeners, and we will catch you next time.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.